Reynolds Journalism Institute at the University of Missouri. Welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. October 9 marks a sad milestone for journalists around the world. It's the 444th day that American journalist Jason Rezaian has been a prisoner in Iran, matching the time of the Iran hostage crisis that stretched from November 1979 to January 1981. The 39-year-old Rezaian is the Washington Post bureau chief in Tehran. In July of 2014, Iranian authorities raided the home of Rezaian and his wife, taking both into custody. His wife, Yagana Saleh, who is also a journalist, was released a few months later. But Rezaian remains in Tehran's Evin prison, facing 4 charges, including espionage and, quote, propaganda against the establishment. Rezaian's imprisonment came against the backdrop of U.S.-Iranian nuclear negotiations, and there had been speculation that he might be released as part of any deal. That hasn't come to pass, but recently Iranian President Hassan Rouhani has suggested his government might release Rezaian if the Obama administration releases Iranians convicted of crimes in the U.S. Today on Global Journalist, we'll talk about what the Committee to Protect Journalists has called the judicial kidnapping of the Washington Post Jason Rezaian and what it tells us about Iran's government. But first, let's bring in Robbie Stauder. In addition to being an award-winning producer and cinematographer, he's also a childhood friend of Rezaian. Robbie, thanks so much for joining us on Global Journalist. Give us, if you would, just an update on the latest status of Jason's case. Have there been any new hearings? What's going to happen next?
Well, no one really knows what's going to happen next. You know, his last hearing, I think, was back in early August, and they were supposed to announce a verdict a week after that, and they never did. And we're still waiting for that verdict. So basically, we're just in a holding pattern until the Iranians make a move. And
tell us, if you would, about the weeks that led up to Jason's arrest back in 2014. Is this something that he saw coming?
He didn't tell me if he did, and I think that he would have. I mean, he was actually planning to visit me in New York, you know, days after he was detained. I mean, I was expecting him within a week, so it was a huge surprise to me and a shock. You know, Jason has always been a very cautious reporter. Reporting as a reporter based in Tehran, it's a difficult landscape as an international reporter, and you know, he's been doing it for a long time. He has been an accredited journalist for over 10 years as a freelance journalist, and then he was full-time at the Washington Post now for, I think, 3 years. He knew the landscape very well, and he knew how to operate within it. And, you know, it was just a huge shock to me. I didn't see it coming at all.
And what can you tell us about the conditions in which he's being held?
Well, you know, we don't know exactly. I mean, what we do know is that, you know, for a long time he was in solitary confinement, and his treatment was not great. He lost a lot of weight. He had some health problems. Then, you know, later his wife was allowed to see him. Then subsequently his mother was allowed to see him. He's been moved into a cell with another individual, but they're sort of in an isolated wing. And he doesn't get a lot of human interaction, which it must be devastating for him. Jason's an incredibly social person, had a large network of friends, and you know, being isolated this long, I think, is taking a tremendous toll on him.
You stayed in touch with him closely while he was in Iran. Do you get the sense that there was a particular story that he did that got him into trouble? I know his last story was kind of a feature story about Iranians playing baseball or baseball in Iran. Did he have a good idea of where the lines were for reporters in Iran and sort of which lines you couldn't cross?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, like I said, he's been there for, as a reporter, working as a reporter for over 10 years. There's not many international journalists that can say that. A lot of journalists come and they report for a while and they make a mistake, or they shouldn't say mistake. They do something that the authorities don't like, and then they get kicked out. And you know, Jason had a great working relationship with Ershad, which is the Ministry of Information. I'm sorry, it's the ministry that issues press credentials. And he had a great working relationship with them. They knew him on a first name basis. In fact, his press credentials were just renewed prior to his detention. So I don't think this really has anything to do with his reporting at all. And if there's a case to be made for that, why did it take so long for them to detain him? His reporting really didn't change at all. In fact, I would say his more op-ed stuff that he did as a freelancer would be considered more inflammatory than the stuff he was doing with the Post.
And what was the nature of these op-ed articles that he was writing?
I mean, when I say inflammatory, I just mean that they were opinion pieces, and he gave his opinion, and that was about as far into the political spectrum as he got in terms of doing something that the authorities over there may not appreciate. His reporting for the Post, in my opinion, was very benign. A lot of sort of human interest stories and just reporting the news as it happened, and really no slant at all. So I just can't see how this is related to his reporting.
And what has access been like for his family to him while he's been in prison?
His wife, Yegi, was also detained at the same time, and she was in prison for about 3 months, I believe. As soon as she was released, he was allowed to see her about once a month, and then a little bit more frequent to about once a week. There was a time where he didn't see her at all for a couple months. His mother and the rest of his family had zero contact with him until Thanksgiving, when she got a surprise phone call from him. Had no idea that was coming, and that was the first contact anyone had with him other than his wife Yegi. Since then, she's been to Iran twice. She was there in the end of December for about 6 weeks, and she has been there since June. And while she's been in Iran, the first time she was able to see him, I think, twice, and while she's been there the second time since June, I believe she sees him just about every week, although I'm not totally sure about that.
And the New York Times did an article about Jason, noting sort of what a gregarious, well-known figure he was in Tehran, sort of among government officials, talking about the number of high-level contacts that he had. We know that even Iran's foreign minister referred to him as a friend after his arrest. So this article actually suggested that having all these contacts may have actually turned out to be harmful for him. Do you have any sense of that?
There's lots of speculation. Everybody's got a theory. There's been many theories, and I don't think we'll ever know the answer. Even when it's all over and he's here safe at home, I still don't think we'll ever really know why he was detained and what the motives were. There's lots of theories, and all they are theories.
Robbie Stauder, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much.
This is Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. This week we're discussing the imprisonment of Jason Rezaian, the Washington Post reporter who has been jailed in Iran since July of last year. We're going to bring in two other guests now to talk about this case. From Washington, D.C., Sherif Mansour. He's program coordinator for the Middle East and North Africa desk at the Committee to Protect Journalists. And in New York, Farnaz Fassihi, a senior staff writer covering the Middle East for the Wall Street Journal. Welcome to both of you. Sherif Mansour, give us some context here, if you would. How unusual is it for something like this to happen to a journalist in Iran?
Unfortunately, it's not unusual. It's very common for international journalists and local journalists to be imprisoned in Iran, especially in the last 6 years. Since 2009, Iran has been consistently on our worst jailer of journalists list. And last year, when we conducted our imprisoned census, we found at least 30 journalists behind bars. Also, there are a lot of
30 journalists in the past year behind bars.
Yeah, there were a lot of international journalists, including famous cases like Maziar Bahari, dual citizens of British, Canadian, and American nationals who've been also held for extended periods, but not to that many days behind bars, and that's the unusual about this case. This is the longest any international journalists have been held in Iran, and so far the government has not indicated any intention of release without getting even more political gains from his release.
And so you had mentioned that part of what is unusual is the length of time that he's been held behind bars for 400 and almost 44 days now. You mentioned the case of Mazir Bahari, the Newsweek correspondent who was held in Iran. Remind us, he was the subject of a film by Jon Stewart called Rosewater. How long was he held?
I think a little bit more than 5 months. There were other cases as well, which is prominent, that included journalists who work with other international organizations, including Dorothy Parvaz, who worked with Al Jazeera English, other journalists who also were trying to write a book about her experiences, an American Iranian, and she was also kept in custody for a long time. The problem is that this is a part of the regime, the Iranian regime kind of propaganda that journalists are responsible for and are to blame for any problems that happens within Iran. It's something that started with the 2009 contested election, when the government have said that those protests are fueled by kind of like misinformation and agents of the international community who wants to divide and disturb the country and spread sedition.
Well, before we get back to 2009, let me turn the conversation to Farnaz Fassihi. What do we know about the trial process in Iran for Jason, for other journalists? How is this case likely to proceed?
Jason's case, like other journalists' cases, has taken place behind a closed door. The court has not been open to the public. Also, he was not allowed to pick the lawyer of his choice. The government had to approve the lawyer that Jason's family hired for him. These cases are very opaque. There's no clear judiciary process that we can predict how it goes. In the past, some of the reporters were exonerated or released without a verdict. What's unusual about Jason's case is, as Sherif mentioned, the length of the time that he's been in prison.
And you've covered Iran for quite some time, both inside the country and outside the country. Do you have a sense, was there something that he wrote that sort of raised an alarm bell where you said, oh, you can't write something like this and expect to stay in Iran? Was there anything like that?
I can't recall anything. As his friend was mentioning, Jason was a cautious reporter. Most of his reporting focused on human interest stories, features about Iran. I can't recall anything he wrote that crossed the red lines, which indicates to us that he's not being held or punished because of something he wrote, that he's really being used as a bargaining chip here.
Well, what would some of those red lines be?
Well, in my reporting in Iran, the Iranian government would tell us that some of the red lines would be reporting on the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. That's definitely a red line. For a while, in around 2007, 2008, when the women's rights movement was gaining momentum, we were told that we can't write about the 1 million campaign signature, which was women trying to put together a petition of 1 million signatures for parliament to reform some of its laws regarding women. And they're not, this entity called Irshad, which is the Office of Foreign Press within the Ministry of Information, they call you and say, we didn't like the story you wrote, or we like the story you wrote. And they make it clear that your access, that your ability to report on Iran is contingent on, this kind of stories that you write.
Well, Sherif Mansour, you mentioned something in your earlier answer about Jason's status as a dual citizen, and you mentioned that a number of the other reporters in Iran who have been arrested were also dual citizens, Canadian, Iranian, American, Canadian, and so on. What role, if any, do you think that plays in this?
Of course, in many ways it fits into the regime's propaganda that Western powers that the regime have always said are enemies of its establishment are trying and are controlling and are fueling a lot of the independent and opposition voices. And of course, this is one of the problems that a lot of people have hoped that it will eventually be subsidized with the Iran deal with the US and the 5+1, is that it will deprive the regime from this kind of like safety net that they use in order to go on with their propaganda and try to delegitimize any opposition within Iran. Unfortunately, the problem here is not just about the journalist work. The Iranian regime have a revolving door policy in terms of imprisonment of journalists. They have very vague laws that they can interpret however they want, and they've already used it to imprison hundreds of journalists over the last 5 years. The quote-unquote red lines include things like spreading propaganda against the state, acting against national security, insulting the president, the supreme leader.
So these are extremely vague charges then, so anything that you report that's critical of the government could potentially fall under one of these laws.
There is an actual charge called waging a war against God, and that is something that actually journalists have been indicted with and given years of imprisonment in jail.
Well, Farnaz Fassihi, let me ask you about this speculation that there has been about Jason being a pawn in sort of an internal struggle within the Iranian government among different factions there. What's your take on that?
Iran's government is politically divided. The hardline factions, which oppose the nuclear deal, which oppose Iran sort of engaging with the international community, want to keep the Islamic Republic a radical state. And they have been opposed to Jason being released. Now, the government of President Hassan Rouhani, which is trying to be a little bit more reformed to reestablish ties with the world, I think has tried to release him, has tried to lobby on his behalf, but to no avail. I have to mention that this morning I read in Iranian news media reports that Iran's parliament said that it has composed a list of 13 journalists who were spies for foreign intelligence agencies, and they were working inside of Iran. And one parliamentarian said this list that we have further proves that Jason Rezaian is also a spy.
And who is it within the Iranian government that would have the power to release him? Is it the president? Is it the Ayatollah Khamenei, or is it someone else?
It's the supreme leader. It's Ayatollah Khamenei. He could pardon him or he could order his release.
So, Sherif Mansour, what's your take on this then? Is he being held as a pawn by hardliners within the government? Is there really evidence that this is the case?
Absolutely. The fact of the matter is that this was a political case from the beginning. The case against Jason didn't start until several months after he was arrested. So basically, they just hold him incommunicado without any access to a lawyer, without any disclosure of why or where he's being held. And then they went through all of his files trying to find something to indict him. This is kind of like a practice the Iranian regime is using, is that they first arrest, then ask questions. Also, the fact that even Iranian law has not been respected in his case. He was supposed to be released after a year without indictment or conviction by court. He was supposed, the verdict was supposed to come out at least 1 week after he was put on trial and concluded his trial sessions. All these indications that Iran is not even respecting its own laws, and the fact that President Rouhani has now openly said that we are open to an exchange, this sounds more like a hostage exchange more than anything. And of course, we want to see Jason Rezaian released by any way possible, but it's very disheartening to know that he's been held as a hostage by the Iranian government in order to just get more and more political gains. We also think this is going to be a bad precedent for other international journalists who the Iranian regime, if successful, would continue to do the same with them in the future.
This is Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. This week, we look at the arrest and detention of American journalist Jason Rezaian in Iran and how it affects journalists around the world. Joining us this week from Washington, D.C., Sherif Mansour, Middle East Program Coordinator for the Committee to Protect Journalists, and in New York, Farnaz Fassihi, a senior staff writer covering the Middle East for the Wall Street Journal. A reminder that if you're interested in more Global Journalist content, visit us online at globaljournalist.org. There you can read in-depth articles on international affairs and free press issues and download past episodes from our archive. We're also on social media. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Global Journ. Farnaz Fassihi, you still cover Iran. You're in touch with journalists there. Do you have a good sense as to how Jason's case is affecting how other correspondents, other foreign correspondents in Iran are doing their job now?
Every time a journalist gets arrested in Iran, whether local or foreign, it sends shockwaves through the small journalistic community that's there. People wonder if they are going to be next. And I think working in Iran comes hand in hand with these risks, that you're under surveillance, that you get called into interrogation, and you could be arrested any time on fabricated charges, as it's happened multiple times with different reporters. Now, dual national citizens are particularly at risk because they don't have the protection of a foreign visitor. You know, they're considered Iranian citizens when they're in Iran, and yet they are attractive to the Iranian regime because they could gain political leverage with the government of their home country or other nationality. In Jason's case, the U.S. Reporters do what they have to do. I mean, I think at the beginning you're try to figure out what's going on, but eventually you go back to reporting and writing and hope that you're not next.
And Farnaz, you'd heard Sherif was talking about President Rouhani's suggestion while he was in New York for the United Nations General Assembly that there could be some sort of exchange of prisoners that might include Jason Rezaian. Farnaz, what do you make of that? Was that kind of a surprising development?
No, not at all, because in the past, Iran has arrested several dual nationals and exchanged them with prisoners it has. Reporter Roxana Sabari, who was an Iranian-American reporter, was detained and arrested in early 2009, and shortly after her release, I think 3 or 4 Iranian commanders who were held by the U.S. military in Iraq were arrested. So that was an exchange.
So there's a precedent for this then? There's
absolutely a precedent. A French scholar was arrested in 2009, and she was released when France agreed to release a convicted murderer who had killed an Iranian dissident.
So in other words then, because Iran has been successful in exchanging hostages or political prisoners, if you will, in the past, it looks like they may see the same opening here.
Absolutely. I mean, this is something that's been brought up by politicians inside Iran, and the president said in his interviews here that they're open to a prisoner exchange, which, as Sherif was saying, raises the question of is Jason a hostage?
Well, Sherif Mansour, your colleague Joel Simon of the Committee to Protect Journalists, he said that Rezaian's case is a game changer for U.S. correspondents and how they interact in the world. What do you mean by that?
What I mean is basically is that this is a crucial case because this is the Washington Post we're talking about. It's one of the most prominent organizations, media outlets in the U.S. And it's also a prominent case because this is happening at a time in which the U.S., the international community, is negotiating with Iran. And the fact that he was not released, even though he was part of all the discussions with the Iranian regime, sends a very worrying signal.
And so
that,
formerly
journalists
reporters like this were sort of shielded. They almost had not quite diplomatic immunity, but if you worked for a major American news outlet like the Washington Post, it was somewhat inconceivable in decades past that you would be captured and held as a hostage like this then. Is that correct?
Yeah, and other governments are looking and taking notes that you can actually do this and get away with it. And that's the problem, is that this dynamic makes journalists even more injurious. They make journalists the target for a lot of governments to get political leverage.
Farnaz Fassihi, now that the nuclear deal between the U.S. and Iran and the other foreign nations involved in that, now that looks like it's going to be implemented, what scenarios do you see for sort of the general human rights situation in Iran over the next year or two and sort of the press freedom situation?
So far, President Rouhani has not delivered on his promises of more press freedom or better human rights inside of Iran. I think he has had the mandate to improve Iran's relations with the world, to lift sanctions, to find a resolution for the nuclear standoff. But everybody, including his supporters, criticize him for not doing as much for domestic freedoms and issues. So we have to really see now that the nuclear deal is done, will they really try to improve things in Iran? As Sherif said, reporters continue to get arrested, newspapers continue to get shut down, and journalists are very much still under pressure in Iran.
Is there a potential link between sort of economic prosperity as sanctions are lifted and as Iran thrives more economically, that people may demand more human rights, civic rights of this nature?
I think that human rights demands have always been parallel to demands of better economics and better relations with the international community. I think the question is whether the Iranian regime will feel more confident now that the threat of a potential war with the West is lifted to open up the society domestically. We have to see whether that will be the case.
And Sherif Mansour, with just about 30 seconds left, give us your prediction. Are you optimistic that Jason will be released sometime in the coming weeks, in the coming months? Are we likely to see a prisoner swap or just his outright release, or is he likely to be in jail for some time longer?
Absolutely, I think he's going to be released, and I think there is a lot of opportunities for the Iranian media in terms of a lot of the journalists who've been forced outside the country that may be able to come back after the relationship between Iran and the international community has gotten better. And a lot of people count on the ability of people to go freely to Iran and back. That will facilitate a lot of space that didn't exist before for the Iranian media and the Iranian press.
That'll do it for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute and the Missouri School of Journalism. Many thanks to Robbie Stauder, Sherif Mansour, and Farnaz Fassihi for coming on the program. Global Journalist executive producer is Josh Kransberg. Our associate producers this week are Lakshna Mehta, Nicole Osuna, Colby Satterfield, Adam Stork, and Vera Tan. Our studio director is Travis McMillan from RJI. Our audio engineer is Pat Akers of KBIA. We'll see you next time.